Good afternoon, Patriots. This is the American Vision, broadcast on the TLBTV network and brought to you by the Liberty Beacon Project. I'm your host, Bill Muckler, and I'm coming to you from my home studio in Cocoa, Florida, and on Florida's beautiful Space Coast. And today I have a special guest who I've really come to admire and respect after reading his book and learning more about him, and that's Bob Adams. And Bob is a Navy Naval Academy graduate, became a Navy SEAL, and then eventually ended up in the Army and became a colonel in the Army, went to medical school. He's a medical doctor, and also is very involved in organizations helping veterans, several organizations. We'll talk about those later. So Bob, welcome to the show. I'm just really excited and honored to have you with me today.
Bill, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So Bob, maybe you can start off by telling us a little bit about yourself growing up and what your aspirations were as far as, going to the Naval Academy and becoming a SEAL, etc.
Sure. I started out in a military family. I'm fifth generation Academy. My dad was Naval Academy. My granddad was superintendent of the Naval Academy. My great-granddad was an Army brigadier general. My great-great-granddad fought in the Civil War and was commissioned at Gettysburg by Lincoln himself. And so, everybody assumed I would go into the military, but I literally wanted nothing to do with it. At high school, it was going to be girls. In college, and out of the blue in 1967, Reader's Digest published an article about the existence of this secret organization called Navy SEALs. I read that. I fell in love instantly, walked into my dad's office and said, "How do I get into the Naval Academy?" I thought he was going to wet his pants, but that was my goal right off the bat, was to go be a Navy SEAL. And I figured if I was going to do that, I ought to be an officer, and I'm going to be an officer, I might as well go to the Naval Academy. And so that just totally changed it. I've got a copy of that Reader's Digest magazine. I sent away for it and found it on eBay. And it's fun to reread it again. But interestingly, when I got through 4 years of Naval Academy with them repeatedly telling me not to go into special operations because there was no career back then, we're talking about 1973 graduate, I just kind of went quietly, okay, I'll listen to you, but I still want to do it. When the time came up to select for the Naval Academy service selection, I was middle of the class, not an academic superstar, and all the 5 SEAL slots that were available for our class were gone. One of which was Admiral Eric Olson, our first 4-star Navy SEAL, my classmate, who grabbed one of the slots, and I had to go to a destroyer. So I ended up on a destroyer in San Francisco, plying the waves of the Pacific Ocean before I was able to actually apply and go to the teams from the fleet. So it was a varied background. Moved every 3 years of my youth, and like most military juniors, it just coincidences took me where I am.
So you're assigned to a destroyer, and you're an officer, and you're in charge of watches and everything. And I've been aboard enough ships and sailed enough across and back across the Pacific enough times to know that the life of a Navy officer is not as glamorous as one thinks, especially when you're in port, because it's a lot of maintenance and taking care of things. And so maybe you can tell. So that's probably not the most exciting part of your naval career.
So honestly, and I mentioned this in the book, that a number of us that went to SEAL training had spent some time on ships in the fleet, and it's hard work, just like you say. And oftentimes we had Marines on board with us as either our security or amphibious assault forces, and we all worked really hard. And the work day is 24 hours with watches and day-to-day activities, and it can be really boring at times. It can be really challenging at times, but when you look back on, did you really want to do this for 20 years for the rest of your life? Most of us said, nah, I think there's got to be something else out there. And I'm embarrassed to say that because my grandfather, who ended up chief of naval personnel and a 3-star admiral, spent his entire career commanding ships at sea. So some people love it. Those of us that chose another option would often look out at sea and see the ships floating by San Diego going, you know, if we quit, we're going back to that ship, and look at the instructor and go, might as well just kill me because I'm not going back.
So when you applied for Navy SEAL training, how did that go for you?
So I'd been on my ship a year when Lieutenant Scotty Lyons, who was a very famous Navy SEAL from the Vietnam era, came through San Francisco recruiting officers enlisted for the SEAL teams, and I got an all-nav message, and I went, oh my goodness, this is what I've been waiting for, and it was going to happen the very next day. So I went to my operations chief and said, boss, can I have the afternoon off? I need to go apply for the SEAL teams. And he said, yes, you can. And I went, wasn't really asking. There was not much that was going to keep me from going to try. And I got to go, and I met Scotty Lyons, took the screening test, physical, and passed. Came back to the ship, put in all my applications, and then had to wait an additional 6 months because my commander wanted a replacement before he would let me go. So I spent a year and a half on the ship, and when they finally said go, I was gone.
Mm-hmm. And then, so when you received your orders for SEAL school, tell us a little bit about where it is and how you got there, and you know the entire process. And then we'll also talk about your book, which is 6 Days of Impossible.
All right, and we had also discussed prior to going live here that perhaps telling everybody about the SEAL teams, give you a little history first.
Yes, absolutely. Let's do that.
All right, let me start with the history because I think it's fascinating. And of course, it's what all of us learn to love. But the Naval Combat Demolition Units were formed during World War II, and they trained in Fort Pierce, Florida, which is where the Navy SEAL Museum is right now. So in the 1941 part of the war, Navy Combat Demolition Units were training for what we knew was coming, amphibious assaults and clearing the beaches. But that became a formal need, and the Navy decided to form the underwater demolition teams, and that was 1943, 2 years later. And Admiral Draper Kaufman, later Admiral Draper Kaufman, was given the task to form some underwater demolition teams. And so that's exactly what he did. And they took those NCDU units and they turned them into formal training. And that's where the first Hell Week occurred, was in order to be a Navy diver with the underwater demolition team, you had to go through Admiral Kaufman's training program. And that included a type of Hell Week. Well, as you know from all the movies that have been made about World War II and the Navy frogmen, they did a really good job. They had very high casualty rates. They were at Normandy. They were in the Pacific. They were clearing the way for the Marines to land more safely. And that persisted until 1962. The only Naval Special Operations Force that the Navy had was the UDT teams. 1962, secretly, President Kennedy followed up on President Eisenhower's initiative to form a land-based special operations unit called SEAL Team. SEAL stands for Sea, Air, and Land. And it was done in secret. And when Kennedy signed the authorization in 1962, he formed a SEAL Team 1 and a SEAL Team 2, one on the West Coast, two on the East Coast. And they became the land warriors that were from the underwater demolition teams. Well, interestingly, as the Vietnam War exploded, the land and water missions merged, and the UDT and SEAL teams both began doing all the same missions. And so from 1962 until 1983, there were the teams grew to where there were SEAL teams 1, 3, 5, and 7 on the West Coast, and SEAL teams 2, 4, 8, and 10 on the West Coast. And I got to pause there and notice I skipped the number 6.
Yes.
People that follow the SEALs know that there is a SEAL Team 6, and they're the ones that pulled Osama bin Laden out of his hiding place and helped him meet his maker. SEAL Team 6 falls under a different chain of command. which is part of the Joint Special Operations Command. Army's Delta Force and the SEAL Team 6 fall in a slightly different Tier 1 unit level. And that's a subject for a whole other show one day. But so we had 4 teams on each coast, and by 1983, the missions were so much the same. In order to make the logistics easier, all the UDT teams were simply redesignated as SEAL teams. I started out in UDT 11. It was simply redesignated SEAL Team 5. And so everybody suddenly, all the UDT teams went away in name only, and the world began to know nothing but the SEAL teams. So that's continued until today. Those numbers are about the same. And if you want to get into SEAL Team or SEAL Team 6, you've got to go through BUDS. So if it's appropriate, I'll give you a quick introduction to that.
Okay.
So BUDS is Basic Underwater Demolition SEAL Training. That's what BUDS stands for. And it's in Coronado, California. And it's the only place they do it. Initially, we also did it in Little Creek, Virginia, which is where our East Coast teams are stationed. But now all the training is in Coronado, California at the Bucklew Center, named for one of the founders of the UDT teams, Phil Bucklew. And it's a 6-month basic training course. Now, my book says 6 Days of Impossible Navy SEAL Hell Week is about 1 week in those first 6 months. And that week is known as Hell Week. And if you look over your left shoulder, it says a doctor looks back. Well, as a physician now, I've met with my classmates, the 11 of us out of 70 that started, and said, why did we make it? It's been a mystery to all of us as long as we've been around. And each reunion we'll get together, we'll tell the same story, and we'll ask ourselves, what was different about the 11 of us? Well, you had to be something special to go through 6 days without sleep, soaking wet, freezing cold, shivering uncontrollably, pushed to your physical and mental limits, and still go on. And those that do, about 95% of people finish Hell Week will go on to finish SEAL training, which, by the way, is almost another 1.5 years long. Because Hell Week happens in the 4th week of training. We've had 1 month of Olympic physical training to get ready to deal with this task. Then when it's done, you've got to finish the next 6 months of diving training and weapons training and demolition and field work. When you're done with that, you're considered a BUDS graduate. Now, you don't get to put on the Budweiser, which is the Navy SEAL insignia. That's 1 year away. And you would go to the SEAL teams, get that additional training in the teams, and then they would award you your Navy SEAL insignia. But now, all the graduates of BUDS will remain at the Bucklew Center and go through 1 full year of additional training. They go to Kodiak, Alaska for winter warfare training. They go to Fort Bragg for static line training. They come back and they do free fall parachute training. They do their advanced weapons and tactics training, the survival, escape, and resistance training. And the list goes on and on. And you Marines went through many of those same schools, but it takes some time to get through them all. And once that's done, then you're sent to a team. You're awarded your Navy Special Warfare insignia there at the Bucklew Center. And you show up in the SEAL team that you've been assigned to and still have 3 to 6 months of pre-deployment training before you and your entire team will deploy to war.
Yeah, and so I know, as a Marine, we went through basic officer school, and it was about, the whole program was about 1 year long, and we had all these various things that we, I guess you would call topics that we went through, some several weeks, some just a few days or whatever, artillery, whatever it might be, and tactics and everything. So you're really highly trained. But one of the things that I noticed in reading the book is there's 2 classes a year. There's a summer and a winter class. And you were fortunate enough to be in a winter class when the Pacific is pretty icy cold.
Yeah, I would use unfortunate rather than fortunate. And I tell the stories of one of my graduates, one of my classmates, Mike Suter, who had gone through his first Hell Week on the East Coast when we did that, got frostbite. It was so cold there during his winter class, almost lost a finger, was was released during his first Hell Week, sent back to the fleet for almost 2 years. And he was a personnelman, so he was able to arrange to be sent back for a summer class. Got into the summer class, pretty sure he's going to make it this time. Unfortunately, he failed some of his swims and got rolled back to our class, another winter class. Where is the justice?
That's the way the military is.
Yep. You know, the other thing I should probably comment on is why I wrote this book, because this is the only book I've ever written, and it took me 4 years to write. And it really boils down to the fact that when SEALs were first allowed to start writing books, because our operations have all been under the radar for so long, I started to read them. And every book mentions Hell Week, and every mentions how the Hell Weeks that we went through helped them survive the combat adventures ahead. I think Lone Survivor by Marcus Luttrell is probably one of the best SEAL books ever written. And when you read what he did, you have to tell yourself, had he not gone through Hell Week, no way he would have been able to do what he did in the mountains of Afghanistan. But I find myself in the unique position as a physician to understand the physiology now of what we went through and the tremendous challenges that a body is put through when that happens, and also to understand the psychological nature of what we went through. And PTSD, of course, is a big catchword these days, and one of the reasons that I'm and you are interested in helping our veterans these days. War sucks any way you look at it, and any amount of war can create tremendous stresses. And that's similar to what I discovered when I started researching the 11 men in my class. What was it about us that we had in common? Because no book had ever told anybody what Hell Week was. I knew what it was, and the 11 of us knew what it was, but we couldn't tell our family, we couldn't tell our friends in a way that they could understand. And I think probably the greatest review that I've received so far on my book comes from the Gold Star father of a Navy SEAL who died in Afghanistan. And he wrote on Amazon reviews that, you know, he finally understood what his son had tried to tell him over these years about the level of achievement that he had made by getting through Hell Week and SEAL training. So I was like, okay, good. I did what I wanted to do. I wrote a book about those 6 days that makes you feel just about as cold and uncomfortable as the men who went through it. And so families can now understand, and people who watch the TV shows or the YouTube videos can now understand more clearly what it means to go through this Hell Week.
Now, Bob, you mentioned the 11, but actually your class started out with 70, and I believe 8 of you were officers and the rest were enlisted men. And as an officer, you were expected to provide more of a leadership role. And also, out of the 70 that started, it was only 11 who ended up actually completing the entire SEAL course.
No, that's absolutely correct. There were 8 officers, 2 of which were ex-Army Green Beret Special Forces guys who resigned their Army commissions to become Navy SEALs. One of them made it in a later class. He rolled out of our class because of injuries. The other one did not, and came back and tried a second time and still didn't make it. Turns out the dark waters of the Pacific Ocean were a little too much for him. But we ended up with 3 officers graduating out of the 8, and 8 enlisted men out of the 70 that started. And it's a proud brotherhood. We've stayed together, we've stayed in contact. 3 of my classmates have died since we went through training, and we've all gotten together at each time to pay honor to our brothers and their passing. But that statistic has remained true to even today. We have much larger SEAL classes because we're trying to create more SEALs. They're a very effective fighting force, very cost-effective fighting force, and being asked to do more and more. But still only 20 or 25% will graduate of the gang that starts. And as a Naval Academy graduate, I should make one additional observation, and that is at the Naval Academy this year, we have 130 graduates that were given SEAL slots, 130. When my class went through, there were 5. And of those 130, there were 300 officers that wanted to try. They have to now go through an entire year of training at the Naval Academy to by Navy SEAL officers and enlisted men to get ready to go to SEAL training. The result of this has been amazing. Almost 90% of the Naval Academy officers that go through training now are graduating. No other organization has even close to that sort of success rate. And mostly that's because they're being reminded about what the training is going to be, what the challenges are going to be, how to deal with those challenges, and how to build on their own 4 years in the military, which is a hardship of its own, and play that into a success story. So,
yeah, and I know in reading the book, when Hell Week started, you and I think it was Ensign Muggs was the other Navy SEAL from the Academy. You were prepared a little bit because you went through something like that at the Academy. So now what you're telling me is the Academy graduates are really well prepared for the SEAL training.
they are now, much more so than we were. And there's always been a higher Academy graduate because you've spent 4 years in the military in a very disciplined environment. And it has its own difficulties and regimens, so that when the world falls on you, it's easier to understand that this is just part of the test. And we've been tested before, and we're going to keep going.
So as you went through the Hell Week, the 6 days, that started actually Sunday night around midnight, and you were given the weekend off, which was really a good thing, I guess, to kind of rest up and build up your caloric intake. But did you go through the entire week without sleep, and how, and did they give you an opportunity to have meals, or did you have hot meals? And were you, and I know you were in the water a lot, so and it's icy cold, and you have your uniforms on it sometimes, and your boots are full of ice water. And so tell us a little bit about how all that worked, because that's really grueling.
So it is, and it's hard to say what you just summarized in a paragraph, which is why I spent a whole book talking about just these 6 days. But it does. It starts at midnight on Sunday, and it starts with loud bangs and automatic weapons and water hoses and complete disorientation. And 1 or 2 people will walk away in the first hour of Hell Week just because it's so distressing. But the sleep issue has been around since the World War II days of the Naval Combat Demolition Units. We're going to push you, push you, push you, push you. And nowadays, the Hell Week hasn't changed much at all from the old days, but it's better monitored. There's doctors present. There were when we went through, but they're doing routine checks, looking for signs of infection. We also spend a day and a half in the famous mud flats between San Diego and Mexico, which is a sewage-filled runoff of dark muck that we basically are taken there to learn to get away from our aversion to being wet and dirty, which is a natural human aversion. And there's a logical combat reason for that. SEALs operate in really dark, mucky waters and environments, and the enemy doesn't want to be there, so it's a great way to sneak up on him. But the sleep deprivation issue shows up in about the 4th or 5th day of Hell Week when people start hallucinating. And this is a well-known medical phenomenon that, sleep deprivation, which has been used in prisoner of war camps, is a very disorienting thing to go through. And when it happens, it's fascinating. We'd be paddling a boat in the middle of the night, and somebody would start whacking at the water, screaming about sea monsters, or somebody else would jump out of the boat screaming tidal wave, and we'd have to pull them back in. It was fascinating looking back. When it was going on, it was confusing, and that's what they wanted. They wanted confusion, and they would make attempts to let you know you might be able to sleep. When I was in the mud flats on day 4, for example, they made us set up pup tents, and they'd say, "Okay, everybody jump in your tents. We're going to give you 2 hours of sleep." but you have to change the watch every 5 minutes, and the guy on watch has to walk up and down yelling, "All's well in beautiful Mud Haven by the Bay." So, every 5 minutes somebody would wake somebody else up, and we were down to 18 or 19 men by then. So you might get 20 or 30 minutes of unconsciousness before you woke up and had to walk around for 5 minutes. And nowadays they do try to get an hour here and there during the week, but it's not as a reward for anything. It's actually an additional way to add disorientation, because if you're able to go to sleep after 4 or 5 days without it, and then you have to wake up again to the icy cold environment that you're living in, well, people have a really hard time making that transition from the warm sleep they were in to the icy cold environment they're in. So it was actually sometimes much better to stay awake.
So as a doctor, you've learned a lot of the physiological aspects of this along with the psychological aspects. But now I think people are starting to wonder, I'm talking about you being a medical doctor, and so you wanted to go to medical school. So how did that occur? And you actually changed from the Navy, transitioned from the Navy to the Army.
So that was interesting. When I decided, I had just made commander in the Navy, 05, and that's a staff position, and it's not as much fun as rootin' tootin' frogman stuff, blowing things up, jumping out of airplanes. I was on the Navy free fall parachute team, and I had done a lot of fun stuff as a platoon commander, deployed overseas. Now, as I was facing an administrative future as a senior officer, I started looking around going, well, you know, there's no wars. We're talking about 1978 now, and there weren't any wars on the horizon. And I thought there must be something else I could do and stay in the reserves and call me if there was a war. And that's what the decision I decided to do, was to go into the reserves, stay active. If there was a war, they'd call me, and then I would go seek my fortune in the business world. I went back to school, got an MBA, didn't like that very much, and started looking around, quickly realized, you know, I should probably go back on active duty. So I called the Navy and I said, bring me back. You know, it's only been a year. I want to play with you guys again. And they went, no, thank you. We've had, you know, a continually drawdown since the Vietnam War. We don't need more SEALs, we need less. So I found myself stuck in that, they don't need me now move. So one day I went home to my wife and I said, you know, I want to do something that is as fun and rewarding as being a platoon commander in the Navy SEALs. And the only thing that has ever really caught my attention was biology and those kinds of things. And doctors like biology, and maybe I could be a doctor. And I was 30 years old at the time, and my wife said, well, maybe you can, you know, old man, but give it a try. And it took me 5 years of going back to school, getting them on prerequisites, working full time before I was able to get accepted to Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Soon as you get the acceptance, you can fire off a request to the Navy, the Army, the Air Force for a scholarship to pay you away, because it's expensive. And by then I had 2 children. So I fired off a request to the Army and the Navy, and I said, pay my way through med school. And I'm coming back on active duty. The Navy wrote me back and said, you're accepted, here's a 3-year scholarship. And the Army wrote me back and said, you're accepted, here's a 4-year scholarship. And Wake Forest nowadays is about $50,000 a year. And I had 2 kids, so I said, you know what? I think I'm gonna take this Army scholarship because money's money. And when I thought about it, I really, as a SEAL, I was a ground pounder. You know, like the Marines, you and I ever got injured, we were finding ourselves in a field medical center somewhere, you know, close to the combat lines, not on a ship at sea. And I'd spent enough time on a ship at sea that I said, I think I'm going to take this Army offer and the money. And so it was really a decision of common sense. It'll help me get through medical school, support 2 kids, and move on in an environment that works. And as you know, as soon as I finished my residency, which I did with the Army in Washington State, I was assigned to Fort Bragg, which was my request, which happens to be the home of some other Special Forces units. And the Army guys came knocking on my door, and next thing you know, I was the command surgeon of the Army's Delta Force.
That was quite an honor then, and actually, I guess that was something that you could really relate to. And I also want to make sure that everybody understands you're really good at math when you figure out, hey, 4 years is scholarship is really a lot better than 3.
Absolutely. Thank goodness I had those math classes.
So in the Army then, how long did you stay in the Army, and were you with the special forces units in the Army the whole time?
No, my Army career was always as a physician, and I spent 18 years, if you count the 4 years of medical school, in an Army uniform, 14 in the Navy, and then 18 in the Army. And the Delta Force time was just about 4 years, and then was assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division as one of their go-to-war doctors as sort of an in-case situation. I commanded the 82nd Airborne Division Clinic on Fort Bragg and took care of 24,000 soldiers and their families as a family doc. Loved that, delivered their babies, watched their children grow up, and was really enjoying that. And then Iraq war broke out around that same time, and I was invited to go to Iraq with the 82nd Airborne, which I did, and found myself as a full bird colonel now in charge of the medical resources in the early part of the war in the Habaniya area of Iraq. And we took over the bombed out buildings there and built them into functional medical clinics, emergency facilities, mass casualty treatment areas, and spent 6 months with the 82nd Airborne there. With Delta, I was a free fall parachutist. With the 82nd Airborne, I was a static line parachutist. And I don't like static line parachuting at 50 years old, but I did my last parachute jump with them just before going to Iraq so that I would go over there as a jump qualified doc. And the soldiers that you take care of really appreciated that. They did. They loved the fact that you knew what they went through and that you could take care of them.
So after Iraq and 18 years in the Army, then you came back, I guess, came back to civilian life. What year was that?
So actually, we got back in 2004. I remained on active duty for 2 more years as the chief of the Department of Deployment Health, which managed all of the deploying soldiers coming and going. And that, interestingly, is why I've continued to be interested in the veteran support efforts. You know, Valor for Veterans is one of the charities that I'm a big supporter of and that you're aware of that helps soldiers in crisis. And I'm going to put a quick spot in here for my North Carolina initiative. I'm on the board of directors of a soon-to-be 100-bed facility for veterans coming back called the Veterans Life Center. And this is going to be a North Carolina state and private funded effort to give veterans a place like you have in Florida for veterans to learn how to transition from a world of combat and conflict to a world of success and managed care. And they're going to deal with coming down from the combat environment. And I saw that often in people coming back to and from war, believing in their ability or wondering about their disability, and oftentimes would have to hold their hands to help them get ready to move on and be a productive member of society. So I was able to do that for 2 years. It was a very rewarding job. And then 2006 hit, I had enough years under my belt that it was time to move on, retired, and moved to private practice just outside of Raleigh where my children live. And have been in, and I'm still in private practice in a bedroom community of Raleigh, North Carolina. Have 6 providers in a growing clinic, and then still enjoy it.
And you're also involved in an organization called Valor for Vets, and I've just gotten an opportunity to meet some of the principals in that organization.
Correct. And it's funny, I found them because as part of wanting to market my self-published book, because if I don't market it, nobody else is, I was sent some books to the Valor for Veterans group and said, you know, here, give these away as prizes for donations or incentives for donations. And very coincidentally, or very because God watches over good people, it turns out that that organization has an incredibly capable volunteer IT specialist who works for the big corporations who built their web presence. And he said, I read your book. I love your book. I love just the whole idea of 6 days of impossible as a fundraising mantra. And I'll just give you this little tickler announcement today. In the next 3 to 4 weeks, we're going to launch a computerized version of the water bucket challenge that's going to be called the 6 Days of Impossible Challenge. And it's going to be huge. It's going to be focused on 6 ways that you can help yourself or help others. And it's computerized and it's tracked, and major corporations are interested in doing it with their own logos on it. And so my hope is, at least in the next few weeks, a lot more people are going to hear the word 6 Days of Impossible and maybe wonder about this book.
Yeah, and I've spoken on the phone several times with Tracy, and and I'm trying to we're trying to make arrangements to do a show with her as well.
Marvelous, yes. And Melinda Shorman is the other one, and those girls have done amazing things for veterans. They're already very active. There's at least 70 veterans in crisis that they've helped, and they're looking for money, and they've been able to get it from individuals. What I hope that this 6 Days of Impossible Challenge is going to do is going to give them a constant flow of money that'll bring their group and other veterans group together to what I hope will become a national veteran support network.
And I hope so as well, because they've been asking me for some ideas, and I've been emailing back and forth, and I don't know if I can be a major contributor like you, but I certainly want to have some involvement in it, because I'm involved in a lot of organizations and are helping them, and you know, at least on the fringe a little bit. And so I think there's just what people maybe don't understand is that there's an awful lot of us vets around the country that are really trying hard to help other vets, and we don't make any money for this. I mean, this is all volunteer, and we're just trying to help out. And like you have your book, I've got my book in this show, and just trying to do anything we can to help vets, because we know when they come back, there's so many things that, you know, just if they're in combat, just the bonding of their brothers in combat, and then they lose all that, and it's just a difficult life.
No, absolutely. I'm sure whatever audience that you get and develop, and we'll help you get that word out, it's going to at least add to the awareness of our veterans in need, because they're not coming home and joining, you know, American veterans or disabled American veterans. That's the old guys, and the young guys aren't out there reaching out. A lot of them are just returning to their civilian worlds and having to deal with the stresses, and we don't hear about them until there's trouble.
Yes, that's for sure. Okay, Bob, I really want to thank you for sharing your experiences and telling us about your book and all that on the show. And is there anything else you'd like to talk about, or tell us what's coming up in the future for you?
No, not really. I think we've covered it. It's been a pleasure talking with you, Bill. I hope, if anything comes from this, it's an increased awareness that people like you and me and everybody else can individually reach out and touch our veterans and let them become part of the society that we all want to grow and maybe even avoid future wars as a result.
Yeah, and I'm also hoping that with the shows I do, and like with this one specifically, is if we can inspire some people, whether they're vets or non-vets, to volunteer and help vets. And it's like doing community service. And but our vets really need it. They've given so much for us and for our country, and so, you know, we want to help them any way we can.
Good. Well, I'll end by saying, don't forget, 6 Days of Impossible is available on Amazon and Barnes & Nobles and any online bookseller.
Absolutely, and we'll have links to it in all the articles. And I'm glad you brought that up. I completely forgot to mention that. Listen, hey, boys and girls, as you're watching this, I've read this book, and this book is just fantastic. And I couldn't decide if it's a documentary or a novel, but it's easy read, just like a novel. It's very thought-provoking, but yet it's a fun book. And Bob's got some humor in there, and some trials and tribulations. So the book has everything you want to have in a good read. And I would hope everybody would want to go ahead and pick up a copy and go ahead and read it and really, really find out more about what being a Navy SEAL is, and BUDS, which is basic underwater training, SEALs, sea, air, and land. So, you know, I've learned a lot. I got it all down now.
Thank you for that.
Okay. God bless you, Bud, and God bless all of our vets, and God bless America.
Thank you very much. God bless.
Okay, boys and girls, here I'm back in Cocoa, Florida, and our guest, Dr. Robert Adams, came to us from North Carolina, and his book, we want to make sure you all know about that. Navy SEAL Hell Week. A doctor looks back and talks about the 6 days of impossible. I really recommend this book. I really enjoyed it. It's one of the best books I've read, and it's really great. And of course, I would like for you to go ahead and get my book too, you know, so you get a couple of books. You got some good reading ahead for you, and everything. So anyway, I really appreciate you watching the show, and we got a lot of more great shows coming up. And so I'll end up the way I usually do by thanking you so much for watching. God bless you all. God bless our active duty personnel. God bless our vets, and God bless America, and God save our America, because we need you now more than ever before.